Assalamu alaikum and a very good morning to all of you students. This is your teacher, Miss Azmana, and I'm here with your week 15 home task. Students, the topic that we are going to discuss today is how to change active form of a sentence into a passive form. Um, specifically dealing with the tenses of present, past, and future. Now students, why this picture? I am showing you this picture of a dog who seems to be very lazy. Is said to be a little passive. Now this word passive absolutely symbolizes a sentence who is or a doer who remains passive in his activities. And the sentence that we are going to turn from active to passive is definitely going to have a subject who's going to remain passive. Use of passive. Passive voice is used when the focus is on the action. It is not important or not known, however, who or what is performing the action. For example, my bike was stolen. In the example above, the focus is on the fact that my bike was stolen. I do not know, however, who did it. Sometimes a statement in passive is more polite than active voice. A mistake was made. In this case, I focus on the fact that a mistake was made, but I do not blame anyone. You have made a mistake, for example. Now students, let's learn how to form passives. First, we take subject and then we add a finite form of to be, that is a helping verb or an auxiliary, and then we use the past participle, that is the third form of the verb. For example, a letter was written. When rewriting active sentences in passive voice, please note the following things. The object of the active sentence becomes the subject of the passive sentence. The finite form of the verb is changed, that is, to be plus past participle. The subject of the active sentence becomes the object of the passive sentence, or sometimes it is even dropped. Now let's see some examples of passive pertaining to different tenses in English language. When it comes to simple present tense, Rana writes a letter. The passive would be a letter is written by Rana. Simple past tense. Rana wrote a letter. A letter was written by Rana. Present perfect. Rana has written a letter. A letter has been written by Rana. Future tense. Rana will write a letter. A letter will be written by Rana. Now with auxiliaries. Rana can write a letter. A letter can be written by Rana. Alright, present progressive tense. Rana is writing a letter. A letter is being written by Rana. Now past progressive tense. Rana was writing a letter. A letter was being written by Rana. Past perfect. Rana had written a letter. A letter had been written by Rana. Future perfect. Rana will have written a letter. A letter will have been written by Rana. Conditional 1, that is present conditional. Rana would write a letter. A letter would be written by Rana. Conditional 2, past conditional. Rana would have written a letter. A letter would have been written by Rana. Passive sentences with two objects. Rewriting an active sentence with two objects in passive voice means that one of the two objects becomes the subject, the other one remains an object. Which object to transform into a subject depends what you want to put the focus on. For example, let's take an active sentence. Rana wrote a letter to me. Now the passive could be a letter was written to me by Rana. Or passive could be I was written a letter by Rana. As you can see in the examples, adding by Rana does not sound very elegant. That's why it is usually dropped. Personal and impersonal passives. Personal passive simply means that the object of the active sentence becomes the subject of the passive sentence. So every verb that needs an object, that is a transitive verb, can form a personal passive. For example, they build houses. Houses are built. Verbs without an object means the verbs which are intransitive verbs normally cannot form a personal passive sentence as there is no object that can become the subject of the passive sentence. If you want to use an intransitive verb in passive voice, you need an impersonal construction. Therefore, this passive is called impersonal passive. For example, he says, it is said. Impersonal passive is not as common in English as in some other languages. For example, German and Latin. In English, impersonal passive is only possible when verbs of perceptions with verbs of perceptions. For example, say, think, and know. For example, they say that women live longer than men. Let's make a passive. It is said that women live longer than men. Although impersonal passive is possible here, personal passive is more common. For example, they say that women live longer than men. Women are said to live longer than men. The subject of the subordinate clause women goes to the beginning of the sentence. The verb of perception is put into passive voice. The rest of the sentence is added using an infinitive construction with to. That is, certain auxiliary verbs and that are dropped. Sometimes the term personal passive is used in English lessons if the indirect object of an active sentence is to become the subject of the passive sentence. Passives are used when the focus is on the action. We don't know or it's not important who or what is performing the action. For example, my bike was stolen. Now, over here in this sentence, we see that focus on the action is more. We don't know who stole the bicycle. If we want to say who or what causes the action, we use by. Sometimes it's more polite to use passive instead of active. For example, a mistake was made. Now, instead of saying you made a mistake, we don't blame anyone. Students, we have often observed in the news that we listen or the newspaper that we read that mostly passive form is used to give the news or to break some um, fact or some news that has taken place. Differences between active and passive sentences. When we use an active verb, we say what the subject does. For example, my grandfather was a builder. He built this house in 1935. It's a big company. It employs 200 people. When we use a passive verb, we say what happens to the subject. The house is quite old. It was built in 1935. 200 people are employed by the company. So the major focus is on the action, then the doer. Now let's see what could be the form of the passive sentence. We use, after the subject of course, we use be form of the verb. Now the be form of the verb are the helping verbs or the auxiliary verbs like is, is, am, are, was or were. Plus we are going to use the past participle, that is the third form of the verb. And of course the third form could be done or cleaned or seen. The object of the sentence, of the active sentence, becomes the subject of the passive sentence. The subject of the active sentence becomes the object of the passive one, or sometimes it is even eliminated if not needed. Alright students, let's take a look at some of the verbal tenses. Future simple, will and other modal verbs. I will write a letter. A letter will be written. It could be by me, or if you do not want to add a subject, that's fine. I can write a letter. A letter can be written. I could write a letter. A letter could be written. I may write a letter. A letter may be written. I might write a letter. A letter might be written. I should write a letter. A letter should be written. I must write a letter. A letter must be written. I have to write a letter. A letter has to be written. I ought to write a letter. A letter ought to be written. Now, students, let's cope up with be going to verbs. I'm going to write a letter. A letter is going to be written. Now, students, one of the other forms of the verbal tenses that you need to know how can we make a passive of. I don't like being. Let's see the detail. The passive of doing, seeing, etc. is being done and being seen. For example, I don't like people telling me what to do. The passive could be I don't like being told what to do. Steve hates being kept waiting. Thank you very much, students. I hope the actives and the making of the passives of certain sentences and all the tenses of English is now clear to you. You can always ask questions in your class. Take care of yourself. Bye bye.